Next speaker, John Hornick, has been a counselor and litigator in Washington, D.C. for over 30 years. He's the author of the book 3D Printing Will Rock the World, which won a Silver Award from the Nonfiction Authors Association and 4.5 stars from Indie Reader, and has been called a must-read. Please help me welcome Mr. John Hornick.
Thank you, Maureen. Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me here. This has been very interesting. I don't know anything about law enforcement and social media. I learned a lot today. And I don't know how much you know about 3D printing, but I'm going to try to teach you something about 3D printing in law enforcement this afternoon. I am very deeply involved in the 3D printing industry, and that led me to write this book, 3D Printing Will Rock the World. And recently, within the last couple of years, I'm starting to get an increasing number of requests from law enforcement for them to learn about 3D printing, how it can be used to help, and how it is being used to facilitate crime. Now, there have been 4 disruptive game changers in the history of civilization. First we had fire, and then we had the wheel, and then we had the Industrial Revolution, and then we had the digital revolution, and now we have 3D printing. Now, I intentionally chose this photo of a consumer-grade 3D printer printing out a Yoda head, because this is what most people think 3D printing is. And this is part of it. There's an industrial side, and there's a consumer side. This is a consumer machine. And this is, in fact, part of 3D printing. But this jet engine is also 3D printing. And this Shelby GT is 3D printing. And this weapon, and this is a real weapon, I'll talk about it later, this is also 3D printing. Now first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what 3D printing is, because I don't know what the baseline is here. 3D printing is basically, it's also called additive manufacturing. It's layered manufacturing. You're building up a part or a product, whatever it happens to be, layer by layer by layer until you have a finished part. And recently there have been some machines that have been able to put out parts that are instantaneously whole. In other words, comes out of the machine whole, not in layers. Now really, 3D printing is just an umbrella term for a lot of different types of technology, which have been defined by the International ASTM. And I'm not going to go into what those are today. There's 7 basic types. I go into them in my book. You know, in some of the in-house training programs I do, I go into this a lot more detail. But it's basically 7 different types of technology and some newer things that are coming along the way. Now, 3D printers, as I said, we have a consumer grade and we have an industrial grade. Somebody made an arbitrary cutoff that a consumer machine is anything that costs less than $5,000. Industrial machines range from $5,000 to $5 million. The average selling price in 2015 was $97,000, up from $87,000 the year before. But there is a dark side of 3D printing. I want to talk about that. But before I talk about the dark side, I'm going to talk about the bright side. First of all, 3D printing is rocking manufacturing. First, you have a machine that has the capability of making a part or a product with no assembly required. Imagine that. An entire part or entire product comes out of the machine. This is very powerful. Because it used to be that we'd have a whole room full of machines that made a part or a product. Now we can have one machine that makes that part whole. This allows you to bring manufacturing back to countries like the United States that have high labor costs. Also, you have design freedom. It used to be we had something called design for manufacture. You could design something and you could hand it to an engineer, and the engineer would say, sorry, we can't make that. Our machines aren't capable of making that. We don't have that limitation with 3D printing. You can make nonlinear holes. You can make honeycomb structures, variable wall thicknesses. Also, 3D printing is cost neutral. It doesn't cost any more on a per part basis to make a highly complex part or product. It doesn't cost any more on a per part basis to make one of a kind. And it doesn't cost any more on a per part basis to make something that's highly customized. And this is totally different from the history of manufacturing. It always costs more to make only one. It always costs more to customize. It always costs more to make it complex. Also, we have part count reduction. This is a famous GE fuel nozzle, which you'll see in any 3D printing presentation out there. And when it was made with traditional manufacturing, it was made in 18 to 20 parts. In 3D printing, it's made with 1. 3D printing also can eliminate shipping and warehousing. So you can have any part, anywhere, anytime. Because you make things where they're needed, as opposed to making them in far-off lands, shipping them to where they're needed, storing them in warehouses. Now, all of these benefits that I just mentioned, they benefit both the good guys and the bad guys. Now, 3D printing is also leading to a paradigm shift, and that paradigm shift is that it eliminates barriers to entry, so anyone can manufacture anything, and that democratizes manufacturing. And again, this is something that benefits both the good guys and the bad guys. Right? In 3D printing, appearances can be deceiving. We're accustomed to things looking and feeling a certain way. We're accustomed to a certain look for every product that we know. But this is a running shoe. This is an automobile. These are drones, and this is a violin. So we can have fundamentally different designs. Again, this can benefit the good guys, and it can benefit the bad guys. Now we'll talk a little bit about the dark side. Little thought experiment. What would it be like? What would it be like if anyone could make anything away from control? Now, if away from control is a concept that I pioneered, it means the ability to make anything, make something, without anyone knowing about it, and without anyone being able to control it. Again, away from control is without anyone knowing about it, and without anyone being able to control it. What would the effect of that be? Now, to be able to do this, you'd have to have a digital blueprint. Some people call them CAD files, CAD drawings, digital models. I call them digital blueprints. You'd have to have such a blueprint to be able to 3D print it. Where would you get that? Well, you might get it peer-to-peer on the internet. You might get it from a website on the internet like the Pirate Bay or BitTorrent. Or maybe you get it from the deep, dark web. I don't know how much you get into this yet. You probably will get into it in the future, but the World Wide Web, which most of us use every day, is only 5% of the internet. The other 95% is mostly illegal. So maybe you get this digital blueprint from the deep, dark web. Or maybe you have a 3D scanner, and instead of getting a digital blueprint to make whatever part or product you want to make, you scan the part or product that you have, you create a digital blueprint from that, and then you print it yourself. No one knows about it, no one can control it. So what would be the effect of that? Being able to make anything away from control, what would be the effect of that on traditional business models and on the law, especially intellectual property law, which is my area, or on product liability, or on taxation? Get this? Taxing the pennies on your eyes? I know the British should get that one, right? It's a Beatles song, it's in a Beatles song. And what would be the effect on crime? The answer is that as the democratization of manufacturing increases, the ability to make things away from control, that increases as well, and results in something that I call the 5 I's. The 5 I's are that when you have the ability to make things away from control, you have an increased amount of, my area, IP, is infringement or any type of illegal activity. When you have increased amount of illegal activity and it's done away from control, it's difficult to identify. If you can't identify it, it's impossible or impractical to enforce the relevant laws, and at that point, those laws become irrelevant. They still exist, but if the work is being done away from control, they're irrelevant. Now let's talk about the dark side. First, we'll talk about counterfeiting. Now, 3D printing can be used to counterfeit virtually any product. It can be used to make virtually any type of technology, any kind of product. And in my area, it affects all types of intellectual property. And in fact, the Gartner Consulting Group says that by next year, we'll have $100 billion in annual IP-related losses from 3D printing. These are some examples of illegal uses of 3D printing. These are counterfeit goods, and it's world-class work. Very good work. Also, 3D printing can be used for counterfeiting. Maybe not for making paper money, but certainly for making plates, and certainly for making coins. Also, thieves are using 3D printing today. In raids all over the world, law enforcement officers are finding 3D printers along with other, well, the 3D printers aren't illegal, but they're finding them with illegal merchandise, with guns and all kinds of other stuff. ATM machine facades are a popular thing that thieves are using 3D printers to make. They make skimmers with 3D printers. They've been found in Australia and in France. And there's one person and also a product called Gripper, which they provide. You can get it on the internet, and they provide service 24/7, 365. They have service centers in Moscow, Johannesburg, and in New York and London. And they say that we have the power to mass produce these ATM skimmers with the latest technology. We have all the files needed in printing facilities in China, and we have the files to mass produce the magnetic stripe readers. Keys. Keys are another thing that are being used with 3D printing. Now, I don't know of any illegal uses of keys, but they're being used to make master keys, being used to make bump keys, being used to make handcuff keys. And the digital blueprints for these may be made available freely on the internet, because there's a lot of people out there who like to just make designs and then give them away. Give them away. Broadly disseminate them as much as possible. Or they may be sold on the internet. Drugs. Now, there aren't any illegal uses of drugs that I know of yet in 3D printing, but there has been at least one drug that has been approved by the FDA that is 3D printed. So those are the good guys. And I know of a lot of people and a lot of researchers, a lot of universities, and a lot of companies that are working on the 3D printing of drugs, legal drugs. Now, on the bad side, on the bad guy's side, a guy named Mike Powers, he wrote a book called Drugs 2.0, and he says DIYers may render controlled substances an obsolete relic of the past because they won't be controllable if you can 3D print them. How's that going to happen? Well, you'll be able to 3D print things at the point of need. This eliminates transportation and warehousing. There's a lot of risk involved in that for the criminal element. If they don't have to transport and warehouse, and they can instead 3D print things where they're needed, reduces a lot of risk. How will they do that? Well, they will use cast-off bioprinters. You know, bioprinters gone bad, basically. And there are plenty of bioprinters out there now, and they're using these to develop prescription drug printers. And, you know, a new one comes out every year. Those will get sold on eBay. And I'll give you an eBay example a little bit later on. And the blueprints, that's the important thing. Again, people who want to produce drugs, why take all of the risk of producing the drug yourself if you can sell the blueprint to do it and pass that risk down the line? That, I think, is how drugs will be 3D printed in the not too distant future. That's how it's going to be done on the legal side very, very soon. It's already being done, really, because that company Aprecia that I showed you, and there's some others as well. It will be done on the illegal side in the near future as well. Now, this is what everybody wants to hear about, guns. It all started in May of 2013 when Cody Wilson, a law student in Texas, he 3D printed a gun called the Liberator. And actually, he wasn't the first. I know somebody who was the first, but he doesn't care for any publicity, so not a whole lot of people know about it. But Cody was the second. He 3D printed the Liberator. He used a machine that cost $25,000 to $35,000 new, but he bought it for a fraction of the price on eBay. And this gun was entirely made of plastic. It was undetectable, and that's what really scared people. And Cody, I've heard him speak, I've asked him questions. He's very hard to understand, but he said it was just an accident that my gun wasn't detectable. He said, that's not what I was going for. I'm not really even a gun guy. He wasn't a gun guy then. I think he's a gun guy now, but he wasn't then. This was in 2013. He was experimenting with the idea of what would it be like, what would the implications be if anyone could make a gun without anyone knowing about it and without anyone being able to control it. My idea of away from control, a term that I coined, I kind of got from realizing what Cody Wilson was doing. The plans, the digital blueprints for his gun were downloaded from the internet 100,000 times before the government forced them to be taken down from the server. That was May of 2013. In November of 2013, a company called Solid Concepts, they 3D printed this Browning 1911 pistol. I've held this gun in my hand. It is a beautiful piece of work. It costs $11,000. So we're not going to be seeing a lot of these around, right? And this was done by a company that's fully licensed to do it. But they say the technology is there now to make a metal gun. They did it in 2013. In February of 2014 in Japan, some guys made this zigzag revolver made of plastic. And they went to jail because in Japan it is illegal to possess a firearm, and so they went to jail for both possessing it and posting the designs on the internet. In February of 2015 in Queensland, Australia, the police there said that they did the raid and they found a lot of parts. And when they looked at the parts carefully and closely, they realized that they were gun parts. They said we can identify most, if not all, the major components of a weapon. They just need to be put together. In April of 2015, this silencer was made, and now this is metal. This is the first one that I've showed you so far that's metal. And it was made by no one really knows what fabricator made this silencer. And it had to be made on an industrial machine. The industrial machines capable of doing this start around $200,000. Now, I don't know whether this particular part could be made on a $200,000 printer. But what this means is that it was made by a shop that had sophisticated equipment, and they were making this on the side for somebody who asked them to make it, and they have kept their name secret. In June of 2015 in Chiloquin, Oregon, police there found this AR-15 with a 3D printed lower receiver. And Detective Shepard there said, being felons, they could not have purchased the lower receiver. So this is a way for people who can't go out and buy weapons legally to get weapons. June 2015. In October of 2015, NSA Listbot, this is a pseudonym for somebody, we don't know his real name, he made this railgun, 3D printed this railgun. And he published it on Imgur. Now, I don't know if doing social media you're looking at Imgur at all, but Imgur is a place where designs like this get posted. And of course, there's a lot of design repositories where things like this get posted, but there's too many of them, I think, that anybody could ever keep track of them. But this railgun, it fires projectiles at about 560 miles per hour. Now, military railguns, they fire projectiles at about 13,000 miles per hour, so this is fairly primitive, but still effective. It shoots tungsten, aluminum, and graphite, and one other type of projectile. This is one of the projectiles here. February of 2016, this gun was made by a guy named Durwood. You know, they all have pseudonyms. Nobody really knows what their real names are. And he said, no one had ever tried to get a semi-automatic 3D printed gun working before. I'm just one of those guys. I'm one of those types. It's simple, but it works. The gun shoots great. This gun shot 800 rounds. It was made on a printer that cost a little less than $5,000, and it was about 95% 3D printed. This is the updated version. It's called the Shuty, S-H-U-T-Y. August 2016, this is just last summer, this gun was found in carry-on luggage at the Tahoe Reno airport, and it's 3D printed, but it was it's a revolver, but it was loaded, and that's how it was detected. Now, if you're trying to get a non-detectable gun on the plane, I don't know why in the world you'd load it, but it was loaded, and that's why they detected it. Okay. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of information about this since then. I thought maybe at first it might have been a test, but you know, all of the media accounts I've read said that it was taken from passenger's luggage. I don't really know anything more than that. So that was August of 2016. September of 2016, this gun. Does anybody remember the movie In the Line of Fire? In the Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood and John Malkovich? Remember, he had a 3D printed gun. I'm sorry, it wasn't 3D printed. It was a gun made in his garage. It looked a lot like this, though. This gun is called the Songbird. It's made by a guy in a garage. That's what he calls himself. And this gun is 100% 3D printed, except for the springs, which use rubber bands, which is what John Malkovich used, and the firing pin is a roofing nail. Other than that, it was 100% 3D printed. And then this headline got my attention just last month. U.S. Army successfully tests 3D printed grenade launcher with 3D printed grenades. And this is the weapon. So the U.S. Army made this, and just last month they announced it, and they called this Rambo. That's what the Army calls it, okay? And it stands for Rapidly Additive Manufactured Ballistic Ordnance. And this gun was 100% 3D printed except for the springs and the fasteners. So that is the state of the art of 3D printing of weapons right now. It can be done with an inexpensive machine. The zigzag gun in Japan and the Songbird gun, they were probably done, not really sure, but they were probably done with machines that cost less than $5,000. And the silencer was done with a machine that probably cost about, it could be about $200,000. And then Cody Wilson's gun, the original gun, that was done with a machine that cost between $25,000 and $35,000, which you can get at a fraction of the price on eBay. Now, the gun makers, these guys, though, they're still thinking inside the box. All of their guns look like guns. Okay, but throughout our history, we have had all kinds of things been disguised as guns, right? There's this guitar gun and cameras and a pipe and a cane and a watch, my favorite, the crucifix gun. And so they're really thinking outside the box. With a 3D printer, the bad guys are capable of making a gun that looks like anything. 3D printing makes it easier to do this kind of disguising of weapons. Now let's talk about the really dark side for a moment. And first we'll talk about terrorists. The FBI has created the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytics Center, which I think is in Huntsville. And they're looking at whether, they purchased 3D printers, they're looking at whether 3D printers can be used to make bombs. And the answer is yes. And I think it's great that they're being proactive, they're working on this, they're looking at this question. There hasn't been any 3D printing of harmful bacteria that I know of, but I saw an article just the other day where 3D printing is being used to 3D print bacteria for good rather than evil. In other words, it's being used for some kind of scientific purpose. So it won't be long before the bad guys realize, hey, well, we can use 3D printing for using it for the evil side as well. And there's a friend of mine who wrote another book on 3D printing called Fabricated. He's a professor at Columbia University. He believes that we will have trafficking in a black market trafficking of 3D printed organs in the not too distant future. That'll probably be in 10 to 20 years. Then, of course, there's the ultimate, and that is nuclear. And Peter Singer, New American warfare expert, he said 3D printing could turn sanctions, which have been a crucial part of foreign policy for a generation or more, into an antiquated notion because 3D printers are widely available. They can be used for lawful purposes. There's really no way to restrict their sale or use, and anybody who gets hold of them could use them for really bad things. So let's talk about the bright side. The bright side. Okay, so, you know, somebody said there's only two things you never want to see being made. One is sausages and the other is laws. Well, I can't give you a picture of laws being made, so I'm giving you a picture of a sausage, but I'm going to be talking about laws. Now, there has been, Philadelphia was the first place to enact a law relating to 3D printing, and they made it illegal for anyone to 3D print any type of a weapon unless they're licensed to do it, unless they had the proper licensing to do it. Then in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, they enacted a law that made it illegal to possess a 3D printed firearm either digitally or physically. So that means you can't possess the digital blueprint either. And the penalty is 14 years in prison because you can't possess any firearms in Australia. And then most recently, California enacted a law that said that if you 3D print a gun, you must apply for a serial number and you must embed metal somewhere in the gun. Now, this is all well and good, and I think these efforts to enact laws are good. You can have laws that make sense and laws that don't make sense. But if you think about 3D printing away from control, the laws may be irrelevant. Because if you want to make a gun away from control, and you don't want anyone to know about it, and you don't want anyone to control it, you're not going to be applying for a serial number, and you're not going to be embedding metal in the gun. In May of 2015, in Birmingham, England, there was something called the suitcase murders. And I think it might have been better called, actually it would have been a much better name if they'd called it the rear window murders, because it was very similar. As in Rear Window, the guy, he killed his wife and he cut her up and then put her into a suitcase. Same thing happened in Birmingham, and also parts were burned as well. And the Birmingham police there, they used 3D printing and 3D scanning to help to put together what happened and then to prove it in in court, and they convicted the murders. And they found a piece of bone in an oil can in the big oil barrel in the backyard of the accused, and they found a piece of bone there. And then they found a piece of bone in the suitcase, but they were in terrible condition, so they were able to 3D scan them, 3D print them, and show in court that they were a perfect match. And that helped to lead to the conviction. So it helped to solve, 3D printing helped to solve and also lead to a conviction in the suitcase murder. July of last year, Michigan State University, they 3D printed fingerprints. And they can be used to unlock iPhones. So if you have a fingerprint, and these fingerprints were fingerprints that had been taken while a person was alive, and then the fingerprints were then used to make the 3D printed fingerprints at a later time. And then the fingerprints, they have a special process that they developed, and then when you they had to embed metal particles, because if you just take an impression of fingers and you 3D print it, it doesn't have the electrical charge that you need to be able to make your phone work. So they were able to develop a process of embedding metal particles, and then they were able to use it to unlock the phone. Now, that's the bright side. Now, to the dark side for a moment, the same people realized that this same technology could be used to make 3D printed hands or fingerprints that could be used to overcome fingerprint scanners or even the type of scanners where you just wave your hand in front of them. And that was just this past October that they realized, hey, we did something good here, but maybe it could also be used for bad. Now back to the bright side, and that's where I'll end, and that is with the fact that down in Florida and also in Ohio, in Florida, police there are using I think it's Florida State. I hope it's Florida State, not the University of Florida. Anyway, one of the universities in Florida are helping the police with 3D printing to help to solve cold cases. And an example of that was done also in Greene County, Ohio, where a woman was found in the woods near Dayton, and she was badly decomposed, and they were unable to identify her. And it never really, I'm not in law enforcement, it's never occurred to me that until they can identify her, they can't possibly look for how it happened, right? So with 3D printing, they were able to reproduce the skull intact, and then model makers fleshed it out with clay. That led very quickly to identifying who she was, and then that kicked the investigation into high gear, and they did find who did it, and they did convict the person, and the person went to jail. So it was a happy ending to that story. So the next steps for all of you would be to read my book, and if anybody is interested in that, afterward, give me your card, and I will send you a discount code for the book, and also send you my slides if you want them. And also, if you're interested in in-house training, which is something I do, talk to Laurie. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.